Be heard, but... Hello, everybody. Just welcoming everybody into our launch today. I can see the numbers ticking up there, so we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll start off. Thank you. Okay, everybody, I'm going to get started now because we have been known to talk a lot and talk a little bit too much. So we might as well get started then. My name is Padraig MacNeela, and I'm one of the members of the Active Consent team, and I'm here with my colleague.
Siobhan O'Higgins, sorry.
Yeah. And you're really welcome to the launch that we're doing today for the Active Consent for School Communities program, which is a new offering from us, which is backed up by some really interesting research findings. And so we're going to take you through both the program today and introduce you to the different elements that we're going to be making available to school communities around the country. And we're also going to introduce you to some of the research findings that, you know, we think really is the first in-depth picture of consent communication for Irish teenagers. So, you know, I think it's an important offering to start us off on this journey that we began with colleges, the third level sector, a number of years ago. And, you know, it's such a privilege, really. You can see some of our funders listed there. It's a huge privilege to have the opportunity to realize this ambition to move from the college sector, where we've done an awful lot of learning with so many partners and colleagues around the country, and bring that approach into the post-primary school sector. And we're principally supported by Life's Too Good Foundation, Galway-based philanthropic foundation, as well as Rethink Ireland, who fund us through the Arts to Action program, because we, as you will see, have a multimedia aspect to our work as well. And then we're being funded by several of the government departments as well, Department of Further and Higher Education, and also the Department of Justice. And throughout the year, you'll see reference to our online learning hub for consent, which has been supported by the Department of Justice. So quick overview of our Active Consent program. You know, I think a lot of you may already have attended some of our events in the past, and maybe we've got some new friends as well. So the Active Consent program really focuses on young people aged between 15 in this occasion up into early adulthood, and it supports young people and also the organizations that they find themselves in, and which are so crucial to their development, with knowledge, skills, and practices related to sexual consent. Particularly over the course of the COVID pandemic, we have expanded our repertoire. So originally, placing such emphasis on in-person engagement with young people, either in workshops or in drama presentations. Now we're bringing that onto the online forum as well. All the work that we do is based on research findings, and we also draw on a number of diverse disciplines too. As I mentioned, we began in the college sector, and we're really excited and again honored with the opportunity to launch into the schools sector. For many years, I guess, Siobhan, people, as we did the workshops with colleges, were talking about this needs to be happening earlier.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is a bit of a gray area as to how early that type of discussion should start. But we're definitely bringing it into the senior cycle, I suppose, Siobhan.
Yeah.
Recently as well, we're working with some of our colleagues in the sports sector as well, which again, as you know, is such a key setting for young people. If I could summarize really what we do, it's awareness raising. So if you're working in a school or in a college or in a sports organization as a coach, as a teacher, as a trainer, whatever it might be, I think really there is a responsibility for you to have a basic awareness of the issues around consent. But of course, we particularly focus in on our young people. So we want consent education to be a fundamental part of the engagement that takes place through those powerful settings. And, you know, we can't be everywhere, and we don't want to be everywhere by any means. So we want to leave a footprint in terms of training and preparation of professionals, of teachers, lecturers, support staff, etc., in the different sectors that we work. I might mention at this point, because I know I'll forget later, we do have a professional development module, which is supported by the HEA Jobs Stimulus Package. And if anybody's interested, you can register for that with a minimal fee, and that program will start in September. So what are we so excited about, Siobhan?
Oh, it's the whole school program project.
Okay. Tell us about it.
Right. So we start off with anything we do, we start off with research into find out the context in which young people are operating. And from that, we use that data to create resources that will inform young people, as Padraig has said. So it's about, we've a consent workshop, which we've piloted recently this year. We have social media e-learning resource, which is in development and will be available in the autumn. It'll be piloted and then be available. And it's all about supporting everybody within a school community. So it's about teachers, it's about parents, it's about young people as well. And we also have a filmed consent drama resource that again will be available in the autumn, which is very exciting because not everybody learns in the same way. So it's about having the same messaging delivered in different formats so that people can understand. And it's about raising awareness and giving knowledge and confidence to actually communicate about consent.
So we think we're doing it the right way, you know, to go and really research these topics at a fundamental level and draw conclusions. And for example, we'll tell you about stories and statistics today that later, you know, are turning up in the consent workshop, and the young people who take part in that, they'll hear the same type of information, I guess, that people are going to hear about today. So we're bringing all that information back to the people who gave it to us really, you know, in the beginning. So, and that's why we're very keen to say program. So it's not like a one-off workshop, if you like, but definitely I think the baseline would be for schools to engage with the consent workshop, which is approximately an hour, I think, Siobhan, is targeting really the post-primary school pupils in the senior cycle.
Yeah.
And allied with that, really, because we take this ecological approach, the school should be engaging with awareness raising and training for the parents, or guardians, the teachers and other professionals linked to the school. So again, if you're working in the youth sector, for example, or any of these other allied sectors, would be really interested to share what we have. But of course, because everything now is really so multimodal and different ways of engagement, and in particular, because in some earlier research, we found teachers can be a little bit cautious dealing with topics like pornography in the classroom. So we have a sexual media e-learning resource. As Siobhan says, it's just being piloted. We are also actually looking for schools, I guess, to partner with us on that piloting process. So if you'd like to be interested or involved with that, please contact us. And then how I learned about consent, which I believe could be well being filmed sort of
at
as we
this
speak.
moment.
When you look back at the background, you'll see blue skies, because that's what we're blessed with in Galway this week. So it's a staged program. It's more than one bite. It's more than one perspective, and it's more than one angle, really. So, you know, we're talking about discussion. We're talking about the more emotive aspect of things that you're going to get through theatrical drama experience. It's about personal reflection, and it's about teachers really being well prepared as well to carry forward those conversations.
And having those conversations supported at home as well with parents. So that's really important too.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, again, very privileged position. We've now had 2.5 years working with the Life's Too Good Foundation funding, and we really have learned a lot about how to work with organizations and colleges. So we know flexibility is critical. So a school can become involved in the whole program, all those things we just mentioned, or if there's one in particular that you'd like to be involved with. And indeed, we think this would complement a number of the existing initiatives that are already out there. And I think this time next year, we'll also be able to have all of these really interesting resources available on an online learning hub, which we believe would be quite unique, really internationally. Very kind of fancy, complex system of delivery. The bottom line is young people becoming more empowered. It's not about learning off by rote a certain way of doing consent correctly. Self-determination and respect is about having the competence and the confidence to adjust to the different scenarios that you're going to find yourself in. So that's really what we're looking for, and that the people around them are able to support them. Okay, so we're a little bit behind time, Siobhan. So
oh no, not already.
I told you this would happen. So I think that there has been a lot of attention today to the survey data, which has kind of underpinned the development of the resources, if you like. So we are going to hear about that, and this is the source of some of that information you might have seen in the press there earlier on today. And ultimately, I have put this slide up, not expecting you to take it all in, but over on my left, what we're doing is we are paying tribute to the existing strengths and resources that young people bring with them to this form of engagement. We found there was very strong support for the principle of getting consent. We also found that young people were very sophisticated in their capacity to recognize non-consenting behavior and piece together an understanding of what's going on in the different stories that we presented. People will certainly clearly refuse to accept unacceptable behavior from an initiator, somebody who's trying to keep going until they're told to stop. So there's a lot going on for our young people. However, there's a lack of consistency, I would say, in the population as well. So verbal consent not being seen as required all of the time, people struggling a little bit more with the complexity of real life stories and scenarios. So great on the principles, we're falling down a little bit in the practice. And that's why we believe the type of engagement that we have on offer works well, because you really get to grips with the real life scenarios, I think. Okay, so Siobhan, over to you for a few minutes to give us an illustration, I suppose, of these 4 resources, looking at the workshop in particular.
Yeah, because the workshop was piloted this year after Easter with 10 schools all over the country. So as you can see, this is our process, a little slide about our process. So we do the research data, then we have understandings of the theory of how young people develop and gendered sexual norms and sexual scripts. We pilot everything to make sure it's acceptable, feasible and effective, and we hope that it will be affecting public and policy engagement as well. So working with the young people, what we did was we got youth panels, and the involvement and advice of youth panel members was key to ensuring that the language, tone and learning outcomes were relevant, engaging and effective. So these are some of the comments from the youth panels that we first engaged with way back in 2020, before COVID. So they understood, so they were very clear that this was going to be a good resource. They thought it was realistic, all of that, so that worked very well. And they liked the idea of real life stories because they shed light on situations where consent isn't given, and to explore all of that. And it's a reflective piece rather than being told what to do. So on we go. So then what happened? COVID. So COVID, like for every part of society, had major disruptive effects and made everything very uncertain, but in terms it had positive effects too. So we were able to explore different ways of delivering the workshop. So we took the workshop that we piloted already and had worked with 2 youth panels to be a face-to-face workshop in the classroom. It was then pivoted, and working with the Union of School Students who helped us to pivot that to being COVID friendly, so delivered online or in class in a COVID friendly way. So we have all these different ways of delivering the workshop, and we were able to see how effective it was, if that actually affected it. And the one negative was if it was totally online, i.e. teachers there online, students online, and the facilitators online, that was slightly less effective than actually being able to facilitate discussions in class.
Well, you could have a situation where you're working remotely and you're being zoomed into a classroom,
yes,
essentially.
So we were zoomed into several classrooms all at the same time in one school, 5 different classrooms, and the teachers were there to facilitate the discussion of the young people in the classroom. So it's all about the young people discussing, thinking, reflecting, and seeing the importance of the data, and then stepping back and then applying that to their own understanding of how they would ever choose to be, if they choose to be, and to say that it's not compulsory either to become physically intimate with someone else, which is interesting because some people think that you have to do these things because everybody else is doing it. So these are some of the learning outcomes of the workshop. So it's about being confident and knowledgeable about consent. So understanding consent as OMFG, ongoing, mutual and freely given, which is the acronym that students came up with, which is very effective, easy to understand, and is played out in the stories that we looked at in the survey and in the workshop. And it's about all relationships, all orientations and genders, and to be very clear about what is the difference between consent and non-consent. Is a smile enough? You know, it's the importance of being active, not passive about your consent behaviors. So in that circumstance, they need to be given language, because they're saying, we don't know what to say, you know, it's embarrassing, it's awkward, what do you say? So it's about talking about the language that they would use themselves, and to recognize how alcohol and gender and drugs may affect an intimate situation, as well as understanding the law. In this case, there are 3 very poignant laws that are related to young people, and their understanding of the law is key to this as well, and to understand what their peers are thinking. So that's the strength of having the data to base a workshop on, so that they can see what other people their age have said, and that is really insightful for them.
And I think when we talk about the survey data, then like you'll see the roots of that in the research that we did.
So then we worked with teachers. So in certain cases for the piloting, we had 10 schools who were involved in the pilot, and teachers came to us and said they wanted to be involved, but also in 3 schools, it was the students asking their teachers. And in 2 cases, the students actually came to us and said, we really need a consent workshop in our schools. So it's really important to train teachers, not just the teachers who are involved in delivery of the RSE program, but all the teachers, to change the culture, to raise their awareness of what's going on. So these are the learning outcomes that we intend for the teacher training, which actually involves them engaging with the workshop so that they can actually feel what it's like, what the workshop will involve, how that will, they then decide how that would best roll out for their students. So in some schools, they said, well, this is perfect for TYs. In other schools, they said, well, really, we need to take it to 3rd years. And in another school, they took it to their 6th year pupils. So it's all about, you know, the teachers being involved and knowing best where the workshop will work best for them.
Well, I think that really goes to, you know, show the lessons that we learned from college, really, because we found, you know, we've been training in colleges for 6 years. We've trained probably over 1,000 people in terms of provision of workshops there. So it's really important, I think.
And some of the quotes from the teachers show that, you know, they're very aware of the situation that their young people are facing, and that they aren't having up-to-date and relevant information to actually base their decisions on. So then we are so aware of how important parents are in all aspects of adolescent development, and they are the single largest influence on sexuality education for their children. Yet many parents underestimate the impact on their adolescents' decisions about sex and sexual intimacy, especially as their children start to become more independent and involved with their peers. And so for many parents, and indeed their children, the prospect of talking about topics such as sexuality is daunting, and the negative press reports heighten this anxiety about how to discuss issues parents feel they know very little about. So it's really important to engage with parents, to inform parents, to support parents, and to give them as many possible resources as we can to actually continue that conversation at home. So it's coming from home and school, and everybody knows what the messages are that are being given to their children. So that's why we
well, I think that's an interesting theory, and like I was really struck because I didn't take part in those, but you know, I reviewed all the examples of feedback that you've got here, Siobhan. So speaking as a parent myself, you know, you would be curious, like what are they doing? What are they saying?
Yeah.
And I think it was clear that it hit the mark. I mean, I'm really struck by that figure of 96% of the parents who attended the seminars thought it would be actually really important learning. And you can see for yourselves there, just some sense. I was really struck as well by, you know, I'm going to bring this home. I'm going to talk to my.
I owe it to my son.
Yeah, that was a really nice one.
But it's also very important because the young people were involved in establishing the tone and the language of not only the survey but also the workshop. It's important that the parents know what the tone and the language of the workshop is, that it's realistic, it's relevant to young people today. And so, you know, the parents actually said they were very pleased with the language, which was great. And that actually gave the teachers the confidence to say, well, this is great. The parents are with us. Let's roll with this. Let's take the workshop and roll with it. So then the pilot itself, I mean, it was great. There were nearly 1,000 young people, and it was a mixture of schools. The majority was 16 years old. The majority were female. And most of them were not in a relationship, and only 27% rated their relationships and sexuality education as being satisfactory, because we know from other research, by not including holistic RSE that looks at consent, that looks at gender identity, all of those issues need to be looked at, and orientation in a real way. All of those are now going to be included in our holistic RSE that is being developed by the NCCA.
I thought that was interesting as well, because you went and worked with classes. You were in effect getting that full class participation, you know, so once the gatekeepers in the school had decided to work with us, then you were going to get the full range. It wasn't being self-selected, which students really bought into the workshop. Right. It was fairly kind of comprehensive. As you say, about a quarter found the RSE satisfactory. A lot of people sort of in the middle as well.
In the middle.
So they obviously, you know, just felt maybe something like this could be helpful for them.
So when we did the workshop, we did a pre and a post survey with the young people, and we used slido.com, and we found this is one of the advantages, or the positives that have come out of using technology, that in fact young people are far more likely to actually express their feelings and give you their real thoughts on slido.com, which is on their phones, because they're using their thumbs and it's not a paper and pen survey. So we found that it actually was very effective, that they do know, as Padraig has said, young people do know the importance of consent, and yet it did increase statistically significantly, up to 96% then agreed, and then that they felt that after the workshop, they actually had the skills to communicate about consent, and that they were then aware that their peers actually do see consent as an important issue, because when they're asked, and when they were asked in the survey, how important do you think your peers think that consent is, there was a big social norm gap between how important they themselves thought consent was, but what they thought their peers thought was important. And this explained their anxiety and fears and embarrassment and awkwardness about actually starting a communication about consent, because they think everybody will think they're odd, or that they don't think it's as important as they do. So it was really interesting that it actually increased their understanding that everybody does believe that consent is important. And you can see that they thought it was relevant, and that they would recommend it to their friends. So we can't get much better than that, really.
This is true. All we're asking for really is an hour of your time.
Yes.
And I was really pleased to see these results, in the sense that this is reminiscent of what we find with college students when we work with them. And, you know, so in other words, we can step it back a number of years age-wise, and you can make those significant kind of headway in people's understanding and confidence. So obviously with the program, if we feel if your students are looking at a sexual media education piece as well as a group, if they're viewing a drama that's got guided facilitation at the end, and that, you know, potentially their teachers are feeling more confident, and at home there's more discussion, that's a full program effect. So it's great to see the consent workshop out there on its own, but obviously, the more the better.
The more different resources on different levels engaging with young people.
I think you'd still be only talking about maybe a 3 to 4 hour engagement if you included all these other elements. So.
Yeah, and the young people stated they were really pleased that their school was engaging with the consent workshop. So I think that this will happen again. And it's like the students said, but what they thought was great was everybody would then be on the same page. If they all have the same information, as Padraig said, they're in a class, they all get the same information, then they know that everybody is on the same page. So this is some of the things that the young people said about the workshop, that what they enjoyed. They were surprised by the opinions of other people, that actually they were the same as them, their own. And one gender non-conforming 16-year-old said they loved it and was really happy that the school are teaching this. So, we got very positive feedback from the young people.
I should say as well, Siobhan, I mean, we're just taking short extracts really from this full report. So if you look at us as active consent at NUI Galway, I think we have that report up now. So
yes, with many more of their quotes, and all the data is there as well as all the data from the survey on which the workshop and all our resources are based. And this is, I mean, some of the boys saying, some of the girls were saying that they were amazed that the boys felt the same way as they did, which was really interesting, and that boys feel pressure too, and it wasn't focused on telling boys off. It was about being engaging for everybody. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody is starting off and exploring their sexuality at this age group, and they just don't know how to do it consensually and mutually agreeable and safely. And so this is part of their education. It's a really important part of their education.
I suppose really you're going on the front foot of mainly talking about consent and the positive achievement, and then sort of over here, the consequence is if you don't have consent, you've got sexual violence.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit different. I know there's some great resources out there that might go the opposite way, let's say, fronting the sexual violence kind of aspect and leading you towards consent. So look, I think those resources are complementary really. And I know we always kind of started off with this kind of approach in colleges because, you don't know within that class the background of the students or what they're coming in with. So, we think you get close enough in terms of the sexual violence information there.
Yes, and they do know all about the law. They learn all about the laws as well, which is very relevant. And they all find it very interesting to know exactly what the laws are, including Coco's law coming from just the end of 2020. So in that we talked to the teachers afterwards in focus groups and interviews, they said it was positive. They liked the scenarios and they really enjoyed having the script because we developed the script and a PowerPoint to go with the workshop. So they don't have to know all about sexual consent. It's there for them and it's very, very clearly written out, and they enjoyed that. And so, and then the teachers were committed to incorporating the workshop into the RSE program. And they remarked that the parents' seminar was also important for gaining support for the workshop, and that there were no issues with parents subsequently approving their child's participation in the workshop, which is a very positive thing as well.
Thanks, Siobhan. So now we didn't gain a huge amount of time there, I have to say, but I thought it was very interesting. So I was happy with that. Now we would like to turn to some of the young people who you worked with us, and hear, briefly enough, some of the, I suppose, comments or reflections. So first of all, we have Flora Nyirenda, who I'm very pleased and proud to introduce into our launch event today. Flora, can I hand over to you?
Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Flora. I'm really happy to be talking to you today. So I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about my thoughts and experiences on the program as a young person who was involved in developing it, and as a young person who thinks and can see, from my own perspective, how beneficial I think it will be. So I worked a bit editing the survey that was rolled out in secondary schools, just to kind of see how the program was going to work. And I worked on kind of changing the language and making it more suitable towards students. And I think it was so great for the active consent team to bring on young people to do this kind of work, to make sure that this program was suitable for young people, as a lot of other programs that, say, I would have been involved with or that I would know of wouldn't be taking this kind of action. I know Matthew is going to be talking a bit more on this about how young people were involved and how great that was, so I won't be speaking about that too much. And I also was involved in working with a focus group. I think there was around 15 to 20 young people brought together, and this was pre-COVID, so we were in a room working together, and it was great to see everyone's different opinions on everything. It was a very open space. Everyone was very welcome to say what they wanted, like all opinions were valid, and it was great to feel like we were really being listened to and we could say anything we had to. Next, I'd like to talk a bit about just why this program is needed. As someone who is like in a secondary school, I think I can see a lot about how young people may have misconceptions about consent and about why it like might not be. I think some older people may not realize just how bad the education is around it and how little knowledge people have. Like just from being in a classroom, you'll hear people saying like sometimes quite horrible things that you would never think you'd hear from your peers. It's really, really important to know that people are actually getting the information about this, and that we want to stop like this kind of toxic culture that a lot of people have. Like even back when there was movements around sexual assault, like a lot of people felt very like attacked by what was going on. Like they didn't really want to learn. A lot of people were very like unwilling to kind of acknowledge that there is a problem with stuff like this. And I feel like if it was brought into the school's curriculum, it would really help some people kind of to change their opinions and maybe just to let people know how important these issues are. And even with some incidences in my school, there have things where say acts of sexual assault may have taken place and teachers may have even like witnessed these things happening and nothing will be said about it. And I think it's quite horrible to know that you're in an environment where things like that aren't really being taken care of. Like no one's really pushing this or seeing things like this as a problem, whereas it's stuff like people being said, like inappropriate things being said to them, like people taking pictures, or even people being groped. Like it really needs to be addressed. And I think that there's a lot of teachers feel uncomfortable saying things about that. And I think in a program like this could really help people feel a lot more open to kind of confronting these issues. And I think it would be incredibly beneficial. Like personally, I was given no sex ed at all in my school. And I think that's quite a big issue. And I think it would be great to have a program, especially not even just a sex ed program, but something where consent is probably one of the most important things when it comes to issues like this. So a program that will center around this would be so great, and to bring in that space where people feel comfortable to ask questions or to even tell stories about themselves, to work on healing from different experiences, or to talk to people about things that may have happened to them. And this is a great way to kind of get those things started. And also, I think it's important for different issues to be talked about that may not be talked about, like pleasure and like the fun aspect of stuff like this, because that isn't really touched on at all in a lot of programs. I think that when it comes to these kind of issues, like problems in society around like sexual assault, or even like teen pregnancy or STDs or anything like that, like the only way we can really stop things like this is through education. And that is why programs like this are so important, and why I think it would be so beneficial for them to be rolled out in the school. I really think this program like in the best way possible, and I'm so happy that I got to be a part of the whole experience. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks a million, Flora. That's great. It's great to hear from you. Thank you. So Flora came on work experience when she was in TY. She's now going into her final year in school. And now we're going to talk to Matthew, who was a member of the, he was the education officer for the Union of School Students in Ireland. So Matthew, over to you.
Thanks a million, Siobhan. So good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. So as Siobhan said, my name is Matthew Ryan. I'm living down here in the lovely sunny south down in Cork. So I suppose a little bit, first of all, about myself and why I'm involved here and speaking to you. So what I helped do with this program was, I suppose, I organised focus groups with the active consent team and our regional officers inside the ISSU, who are officers that work on a regional level throughout the country. And we had 2 of those focus groups. And I think that they highlighted some really, really important things for me. The first one being was that even though the focus groups were about 4, maybe 5 hours long, as I'm sure Siobhan will remember, not a single one of those officers disengaged throughout that, because they were constantly being asked, what's your opinion? What do you think? And the difference between that and if they had sat there for those 4 or 5 hours being told, here's our opinion, this is what you should think, is absolutely immense, because every single one of those officers would have fallen asleep if that was the case. Whereas they were absolutely engaged for all of those hours because they were being asked, what's your opinion? What do you think? So another then, I suppose, few points I'd like to highlight is why this program is different from other programs that we've seen in the past. And I think the one line maybe that I think highlights it the best is that this was made with young people, not for young people. And I think that that can't be understated in how much of a difference that makes to a program when you're a young person sitting in a classroom environment being asked what your opinion is, as opposed to being told what your opinion is. And that was the feedback I got a lot from my regional officers, was they felt so much more valued and their opinions felt so much more valid because they were being asked them, as opposed to having to feel like they were butting in while giving their opinions. And I think that was a huge thing that I heard from a lot of regional officers. So I'd like you to remember that line, that this was made with young people, not for young people, because that, I think, makes all the difference in the world. Another important point with this program is that it's youth oriented. It uses our language, our vernacular. It isn't clinical in nature, because oftentimes what we've heard from young people is when they're sitting in a class and you hear all these fancy, clinical and very proper terms, like nobody listens to that. You completely switch off from that. No young person is engaged in that. Whereas when it uses the language that that we are using in our own everyday lives, because we're talking about this stuff every single day, that's a fact. But then when you go into a classroom and it's completely different from what you're talking about, that isn't, I suppose, effective, and that isn't educating young people. That's just, oh, another 40-minute class we have to get through, and it's really awkward because the teacher feels awkward and we feel awkward, and it's dead silence, and then someone cracks a joke and then it's even more awkward after the joke. Whereas with a program like this, when it's using the language that they're using anyway, and it's made with those young people involved, so that it's not clinical, it's just a discussion and an educating discussion. And I suppose another really important thing is that, while this is just, I suppose, one chunk of an RC curriculum to do with consent, it shows the difference that it makes when young people are involved. And it highlights it again, because when you look at the current RC curriculum that exists and, the feedback we've gotten from young people on it, it's outdated, it doesn't work, and it doesn't, I suppose, educate students on what they need. Because when we're looking at this, we're talking about second level students, which are, realistically the age gap would be 15 towards 18 that this would be given to, which is the most vulnerable group in terms of, I suppose, sexual health, because it's when, everything starts happening for young people, especially around the age 16, 17. So if they don't have, I suppose, the tools that they need to know that they can say no, or know that they can say yes, or how do I say yes, or how do I say no, or as Siobhan said, like, is a smile enough? If they don't know the difference between those things, that leaves them exposed and vulnerable. And, we've seen reports of, I suppose, the incidence of sexual assaults in this country, especially in third level. And it really begs the question of, if all those third level students were given this quality education in second level on consent and how, to say no, how to say yes, how to have a healthy sexual communication, would that have made a big difference? And I think it really would, because they'd have the tools within their repertoire, I suppose, to have those healthy sexual communications, as opposed to doing what they think everyone else is doing, or doing what they've seen in porn or something like that. Which I suppose leads on to the next point of how this program gives quality facts that students need to know. It's not from some third party, it's not from a Wikipedia page, it's not from some video they've seen on the internet, it's an actual backed up resource, which is so important for students to know that this is a fact, because you'd have one student would say one thing and one would say another that they heard someone else, and someone would hear something that their mother told them, and you'd have a load of different, I suppose, varying information, which is really confusing for a young person, especially when it comes to an intimate moment that they're in. They're kind of going, you know, what is right, what's wrong, where do I go, how do I do this? Whereas when you have real information that's taught in a mature way, that doesn't teach young people like they're you know, I suppose, lesser or anything like that, when it teaches them like people and it gives them the respect that they deserve, the difference that can make to what those students pick up. And, you know, no one will ever say it in the moment, because there'll always be that awkward, I suppose, aura when you're talking about things like this with young people. But when it comes down to the actual moment that they're in, when they have these tools and when they have this language, the absolute difference that makes to, I suppose, their lives and their, I suppose, sexual experiences, and ensuring they have a positive sexual experience can't be understated. So I suppose then, to start wrapping up a small bit, I think another important point that this program highlights is how much of a duty we have to protect and educate our young people, because the current way that we're doing it, we know it's not working. We have every year, when 6th years graduate, an entire group of thousands of students moving on to third level education with inadequate language, inadequate tools, inadequate information to do with their sexual health. And we all know that college is where, you know, sex is rife all throughout college. We know that as a fact. And then when we don't have a proper basis to work off from our secondary education, it just leads to massive discrepancies among students as to what they do know, what they don't know. And I suppose it really leads to a lot of negative experiences, which we know can be easily avoided if we give students the proper education that they deserve, and we help protect them from as young of an age as we can. So just to finish off, I'd like to reiterate, I suppose, the importance of including young people in any sort of program like this, because it helps us produce relevant resources that will last, as opposed to just something that was made for young people without asking them, and it's clinical and it doesn't work for them, and then you have to go through making another one in 5 years' time. So when we include young people, we avoid that, and we give them the education that they not only need, that they deserve. So thank you very, very much for listening. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Matthew. That's great. Thank
That
you.
was really powerful from both of you. I think we're out of a job there.
Yeah, definitely.
Glad we went first a little bit there. That was really, really effective. And Siobhan, coming from a health promotion point of view, like, you must be music to your ears about participation and working with people, really, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's what I believe all the way.
Yeah,
that's how we work, and that's how we worked all the way through the building of our resources. So it's about the voice of the people who are involved that is really, really important.
Yeah. Okay, so it's hard to follow, really, like, because I got a bunch of slides.
What are you going to say now?
I have a bunch of slides, but we're really over to those research survey findings, I suppose. Yeah. So the students that Siobhan worked with, the 993, are, as far as I know, different people now from the 613 who took part in our research survey. And as I said, like, we gave people a combination of different items they could agree with, disagree with. People read stories. They wrote in their own thoughts about, like, what were barriers to consent and what helped consent. Yeah. I just tried to distill some of those there so that you can kind of get the overview, really. And you'll see this is just taken from our report. We've already mentioned some of the capacities and capabilities that people have, but definitely from my point of view, I can see the areas that we should be working on with the consent education. You know, so non-verbal behavior was emphasized, very much so. That was seen as okay a lot of the time. Something that's kind of a newish finding to me is just the emphasis that people put on should have, could have, or would have. You know, for somebody whose consent could be in doubt, the amount of kind of focus, look, if they didn't want to do it, then they should have done this, or they could have done that, or they would have done the other thing. And you know, it's just really interesting to see that we have the really clear principles.
Yes. And
they're kind of getting a little bit muddied, I think, when people are seeing these real life type stories. And the negative standards. So if you didn't want something to happen, then the onus kind of being on you to make sure that that didn't happen. This whole area again of willingness, I think, is an interesting one that you explore in the workshop. You know, willing. So I was willing to do it. I didn't want to do it. Does that mean it's non-consenting? We had one story where that came up quite a bit. So somebody might see something as non-consenting, but then they're willing. So So it's quite a nuanced issue there, I think, for people to work through. If people didn't say no directly, as in no, then there seemed to be some wriggle room there. So if I said I want to leave the room, then later in some of the reflections from the students, they'd be saying, look, that wasn't clear enough, and the other person can't be blamed, really. The initiator, the person who's trying to get more and more intimacy, they didn't, sometimes, people would say that was a non-consenting action, but, the initiator wouldn't really be getting a lot of negative feedback, so there seemed to be some acceptance that people might try their arm at something or chance their arm at something, and, you can't blame them kind of thing. So that was quite interesting, really. And and then around the clarity of definitions of sexual violence, definitely, I think people were, to their credit, saying that could be rape, but actually it would have been sexual assault. And then other things saying were grand, that were assault. So I do think that we need more consistency in how we're educating around the nature of sexual violence. Again, you'll see in some of the stats here, the initiator behavior, people maybe need a bit more calibration about being sensitive to, pushing somebody's head down or firmly pushing somebody's head down. To me, that's quite strong language, but a lot of people seem to think, that might be okay. And the power of the sexual script, really. So if somebody had been intimate earlier, kissing or something, then the next thing when they're in the bedroom, it's seen as inevitable that there's going to be sexual intimacy there. So these definitely are threats, and these are the subject, really, of the consent curriculum, for want of a better word, when we're doing this kind of work. So just very quickly, you might have seen some of this already. We're just going to take a quick look at some of the rating statements. So do you always need consent before the start of a sexual activity? And here you can see, like, we've ruled out things like kissing, we're talking about touching people intimately or penetration. We also asked, should there be verbal consent for any of those activities, and would non-verbal consent for any of these activities be sometimes okay? And the twist on that as well, because we always suspect that there's a bit of a social norms gap, we asked people the same questions again, except instead of their own beliefs, now they were being asked to imagine what most other teenagers think. So this is what we found. So it's a bit of a glass half full, or mostly full, it has to be said. Yeah. Like 93% of the female students were in agreement. You always need to get consent. It's just that kind of softness there with maybe 20% of the male students who took part. Most of those were neutral, so they might have been in two minds, but that would be a target, I think, for consent education programming. And then the belief that other teenagers would feel the same way, as you can see, people's personal beliefs not coinciding with the beliefs that they attribute to the other peers around them. So that's an example of the social norms gap that we're talking about. Now, should there be verbal consent for any of those activities? Well, it's a 50-50 or 60-40, really. Not very much difference between the two genders, but that's leaving maybe 40% of the students who did not agree that, let's say, for oral or penetrative sex, that you would need to get verbal consent. I think, as we say, we don't tell people what to do, but clearly that would be preferable. Yeah. And then again, this kind of at the back of your mind, okay, well, I might believe that, but maybe other people don't. And then the idea that non-verbal consent is sometimes okay, about 60% of people saying, yeah, for any of those activities, non-verbal consent could sometimes be okay. So that's that kind of ambiguity, really, that again, we would like to work on quite a bit. Now, rating statements on personal comfort with intimacy. This is helping us explore people's sexual scripts of what they perceive to be normal or acceptable in a particular situation. So if I'm a pupil, I'm being asked, how comfortable am I personally engaging with different types of intimacy if I were to meet somebody at a disco or house party? And again, it's a disagree, neutral, or agree options, and higher scores, more personal comfort. And likewise, I'm then being asked to say, what about most other teenagers? Would they be comfortable or uncomfortable with those actions? And this is what we found. So kissing, okay, yeah, most people are saying that could be okay, a bit of a gender gap, as you can see. And certainly the belief is that other teenagers would be comfortable with kissing or whatever with somebody that they met at a party. touching over clothes, so another level of intimacy, if you like. I think, we're definitely seeing a drop, particularly in the female participants who took part in our study, but they're not really dropping their view of the other teenagers. So now we can start to see the young women in this study kind of getting a little bit separate in not being comfortable, but believing that other people could actually be comfortable. Now, in terms of more intimate touching, we've left out the language, but you can see it in the report. About half of the boys in this study agreed that they'd be comfortable with that personally, but very few of the girls who took part. But again, this imagined other of my peers, they're kind of similar to the boys in that respect. And the final figure is around personal comfort, around something like oral or sex or sexual intercourse. And again, the boys, less of them, as you can see, those numbers are declining each time. But now we're on about a third of the boys who are comfortable with that, they say, but really very few of the girls. So, this is this whole idea of the sexual script, the initiator, the gatekeeper, and how that consent communication is going to go. We saw earlier about the principles that people had in mind, you should get consent. But we've also now seen as well that the male and female students maybe have different views about what's acceptable. And then we asked people about barriers to consent communication. A large part of it was really around social feelings and social judgments, feeling uncomfortable, which is really awkward or embarrassed to engage in consent communication, afraid of disappointment, disappointing the other person, afraid of being judged by the other person. So, whatever I might think personally, I now have this baggage, if you like, of what I anticipate, from other people. And a large part of it really is coming from the social issues. So you can see why we're so keen to get into a classroom and have discussions and provide people with accurate information to help dispel some of those myths, if you like.
Because we call that internalized peer pressure, imagining other people are more comfortable than you are, imagining other people don't think consent is important, and that pressure pushing you to do things that you're not comfortable with and you don't know how to talk about it, and you're afraid of being seen as odd by other people or judged.
But on the other hand, look at the resources that we have to work with. So people themselves, the 15 to 17-year-olds who took part in the study, and there really wasn't very much gender difference in the attribution of these characteristics. What helps consent communication? And there's stuff within you, your confidence, let's say, the awareness and the education that's obviously very much coming from the environment in the school, at home. But really it's about being able to establish a good communication, good relationship. We look into those terms. People use words like, trust and being able to talk and so on. So they're giving us they are identifying the problems, but also giving us the solutions as well. Now, just really briefly, because we had 3 stories, I think they're really interesting stories. They illustrate different aspects. The other 2 that we're not really going to focus on, one concerns a young man who feels pressurized into sex by a young woman. And you can really start to explore the impact of gender stereotypes there. And the final one we'll see very, very briefly at the end. The Aoife and Martin story is quite interesting because it's set up like, what would you say, like a hookup or informal. They don't know each other. They're at a party. There's some intimacy at the beginning. Martin starts to go into initiator mode and takes Aoife into a bedroom. And at that stage, if you're a student, you're reading one of these 3 endings, so that Martin pushed Aoife's head down to give him oral sex, and she smiled. That's all you got to go on, really, in terms of your information levels. In the second version, we experimented with, what about Martin being even more forceful, let's say? So what about if he uses a firm push and she smiled? And finally, what about if he goes back to the first strategy, but now she's not described as smiling? So we're interested in people's perceptions of these 3 scenarios. And again, as we've shown consistently today, I think we have a sort of a mixed picture depending on which perspective you take. People are very sensitive to the idea of a smile. Now, it turns out they're even more happy with the smile being a good level of information for consent than they were in the earlier item. You remember what 60% of them said nonverbal consent was sometimes okay. Mm. But now when we put it in the context of the story where they've been intimate earlier in the evening, now we're seeing those figures push up to 67% for females and 80% for males. Now, what happens when Martin pushes Aoife's head firmly? There is some sensitivity, I think, to that cue. The levels of agreement are not as high, but kind of insensitive, I think, to that as a cue overall. Yeah. And then what about if Aoife doesn't smile? In that scenario, we have a third of the males who say that Aoife consented and 3% of the females. So there's a clear gender divide. You know, we can get that sense of maybe empathy, perspective taking from the girls who could imagine that is not something I would really be happy with. Mm. So, and there's more neutrals in there as well. So when we add in the neutrals, you've got about half of the guys there who were either neutral or who agreed that Aoife was consenting when there was no nonverbal feedback whatsoever. So that's, I suppose, in some ways we've got a bit of everything there about things to be a bit concerned about. Again, things that we can feel very comfortable with in terms of young people. We really like to see the young people who are able to see these scenarios as worrying, you know, to be in a position to influence their peers more strongly and more clearly. A couple of examples for the first version. And indeed, for the second version, you'd struggle to find somebody going way out and saying that was absolutely non-consenting, was totally unacceptable. You're getting stuff like he would have been disappointed, she was somewhat pressured, she may not have been very comfortable. So I don't think you're getting people being really animated about what's going on. The ratings are saying that she's not consenting or they're neutral, but the language really only changes when Aoife is not giving any visual consent whatsoever. And you're getting that kind of stronger language. Another thing, I suppose, that really struck me, and I think we need to get this into young people so they can reflect on it and probably come to the same conclusion we would. There's a lot of weight being placed on Aoife's shoulders there with respect to consent. You know, so she smiled, so she gave consent. There's somebody who agreed fully that she gave consent. The next one, she agreed to going to a private space. This is part of the sexual script. If you go to a bedroom, you know, that's what's going to happen. And people then going into their kind of imagined sense, if she didn't want to, she should have just said no and the fellow would have left it. So would he or would he not? We don't know. And again, back to this language around not, well, you know, she did not resist, she did not refuse, she did not struggle. And so therefore, I think that was okay, or painting a picture of what she could have done. So, you know, there's some quite interesting subtle things. I think you really need something like a consent workshop that you can allow people to explore the ins and outs of those types of scenarios. To finish on a positive, Siobhan, I suppose, another story that we gave portrayed a situation where the one partner who had sex with Alex in the story the previous week tried to have sex again, and Alex said, no, I don't want to. And we asked the participants, is that okay? And 98% said it was okay to say no to having sex. And moreover, when we asked them for their reasons for giving that type of decision, we're back to a very positive culture where people recognize that openness, empathy, and talking are definitely the ways to repair, mend, and address consent communication issues. And so again, you know, the guys who, I think in fairness, sometimes with these surveys, we can come away with a slightly jaundiced view. I was really impressed by a number of the comments from the male students. Very, very clear, really couldn't tell what gender the person was who was writing quotes like this. And so it's right across our communities. We just need to tap into it, and we need to supply people with the supportive environment to bring these types of responses, I think, to the fore. At this stage, then, I think we're going over to our esteemed guests. Great. So, Annette, if you're ready for us.
Yes, hi, Padraig, and hi, Siobhan, and hello to everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
That's great.
we can hear you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be involved in today's launch. And to begin, I'd really like to applaud the work of the Active Consent Programme, because you've really been at the forefront in responding to the need for consent education for a decade now in third level. And it's exciting to hear about the work that you're doing with younger people, particularly transition year 5th and 6th year students. I think the need for such education to occur before young people actually arrive in third level education is beyond dispute. And when Minister Bruton requested that the NCCA would undertake a review of SPHE and RSE back in 2018, one of the aspects of RSE that he specifically asked us to consider was the place of consent within the curriculum. And among all of the groups that we spoke to and surveyed at that time, consent was the most commonly mentioned topic that people agreed needed to be included in an updated, revised curriculum. And indeed, if further evidence of the need and importance of this topic was needed, we have today's research obviously really of interest to us, and 2 reports that were published this summer, one from Ofsted in the UK, and closer to home with Michelle Walsh's research that was published by the Rape Crisis Network Ireland, really shocking but also very relevant, in that she reported that 80% of 12 to 17-year-olds had disclosed being subjected to some form of sexual harassment within their peer community during the previous 12 months. And 24% disclosed that they were subjected to physical or extreme forms of sexual harassment, ranging from uninvited or unwanted sexual touching to more serious sexual assault. So what I'm saying really here is that the need for conversations within post-primary classrooms about healthy, enjoyable, positive and respectful relationships is a matter of urgency. But in doing so, we do need to ensure that we're doing it in a way that is most effective and will have the desired long-term impact. Research suggests that once-off inputs that are led by external facilitators and aren't planned as part of an overall programme rarely have a long-term educational impact, and in fact, in some cases, even can do more harm than good. However, where the external agencies partner with schools to support and complement and contribute to a school's comprehensive SPHE programme, then such partnerships can be really valuable. And this is affirmed in the department's circular of 2018, circular 0043. I think this particular circular is really important because it sets guidelines for good practice when schools are engaging with external projects and facilitators such as yourselves. And I think it's also fair to say that the Active Consent project that's running in schools that we've heard about today would appear to meet most, if not all, of the characteristics of good practice, particularly where we hear about a whole school approach that's addressing an identified need. We've heard about it being delivered to, not just delivered to students, but also developed by and with students, which Matthew was talking about very forcefully, and that goes way beyond the guidelines. It's even better than good practice. And the involvement of school staff is really important here, and not just the involvement, but the building of teacher capacity, which is a feature of this project. Because in the long run, this is not only going to make this project more sustainable, but also more effective, because it's the classroom teacher who's best placed to know their students and also to be able to provide ongoing learning opportunities beyond a 1-hour workshop. The involvement of parents too is something that we found and heard from parents themselves during the review of RSE as being something that they really wanted. They understand and recognise the need for school-based RSE, but they also want to assume their role and to be able to have conversations with their children. And they're at a loss to know, as Siobhan said earlier, how to go about doing this. So the kind of support that they're getting through being involved in this project is building their confidence as well and enabling them to go home and have important conversations with their children. A further positive feature, I think, of this project is the way in which it's attempting to frame things in a positive manner and create positive outcomes, and particularly trying to strengthen the capacities and skills of young people to be able to have mastery over their own lives and to be able to have a sense of self-efficacy and feel empowered to be able to manage relationships, whether it's in the online or the real world. And when we again talked to young people as part of the review of RSE, the kind of SPHE classes that they wanted to have were ones very much in line with the approach that's been taken in this project. They wanted factual, up-to-date and relevant information. They wanted opportunities to engage in open and non-judgmental discussion about topics that were really relevant to their own lives. But in acknowledging and affirming the value of this project that we're hearing launched today, I think it would also be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge that such interventions can only go so far, both in terms of the numbers of schools that they can reach and the depth of awareness that can be created through short-term interventions. If it was only about transmitting information, then it would be an easy job. But we know that the process of building self-awareness, positive self-esteem, empathy, and respect takes time, and it takes even more time to build young people's awareness and their capacity to critique and challenge societal attitudes and behaviours and cultural norms. And to achieve this, young people need and deserve comprehensive, integrated, consistent, coherent programmes of SPHE that are taught across all classrooms and all schools by competent and qualified teachers. And in the review of RSE, this was the critical success factor that all of the stakeholders that we spoke with or sent us their views agreed was the single most important thing if we're to improve the experience of RSE in schools. So in this scenario then, education about consent would begin in early childhood and continue through primary into junior cycle and through to senior cycle, and be done in an age and developmentally appropriate manner. So for example, in the infant classes, this is where many of the fundamental principles of consent can be taught, such as skills of empathy, skills of communication, and understanding how to respect their own boundaries and the boundaries of others. For example, small children can be encouraged just simply to seek permission when touching other children, asking, "Can I hold your hand?" Through picture books like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, one familiar to us all, no doubt. This is where children can be invited to consider, did Goldilocks actually seek permission before touching other people's things? And so in concluding, when it comes to developing the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes and the values for creating and maintaining healthy relationships, I think we also need to acknowledge that schools are just one part of it, and we all know that we can't do it all. So we need an ecological response, and this was referred to earlier by Padraig. And I think we need an ecological response in the context of working together in a multi-agency, multifaceted and collaborative manner that harnesses the expertise and experience of schools, of universities, of the informal youth sector, the formal sector, health experts, media, NGOs and support services, and all with expertise in this area. And so today I think is a really good example of that kind of interagency collaboration. And it's evident in the people who are tuned in today indeed as well. And so again, I just want to say thanks and congratulations to all involved and wish you well with this project.
Thanks so much, Annette, for the comments, very profound comments. I think, you know, you such the big picture there and the whole thing around systems change. It's a really interesting topic. So I suppose we're interested to see how we can play, you know, some small role in there as well. And you know, one of the projects that we helped evaluate there, the TUSLA and Rape Crisis Centre project, which has now gone on to become Consent Aid, another great example. Or for OIGA, and you know, there's a lot of them out there, of course. I often think, you know, the topics that we're talking about, you know, they do have an underlying kind of principle of respect and values and so forth, and so applicable to mental health or being good to each other or empathy and so on. So it's all a big set of pieces there to be joined together. So thank you for that. And Niall, can we call on you? I knew we were not going to keep it to an hour, so I didn't try. And but I'm really encouraged by the persistence of our participants today, who are hanging in there, no problem, and looking forward to your words of wisdom. Thanks, Niall.
Thank you very much, Padraig. Are you okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, great. Really delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation, for Siobhan, and to all the team at Active Consent. I suppose a number of people have commented on the concept of hearing the views of children and young people and taking into consideration their wishes in line with their age and understanding. And that's at the very center of the work we do in the Ombudsman for Children's Office, and it's the essence of children's rights, you know, listening to and following through on the wishes of children. And I think the way it was set up, this program is really strong in that, from that point of view. It's fantastic. The active consent team, the way you've developed it as well, comprising of a consent workshop, sexual media e-learning resource, and awareness education and training for both teachers and parents is crucial. The consent workshop supports young people in the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and confidence, while the sexual media e-learning resource increases and this is the bit I love, critical understanding of pornography, body image, and consent. And I think that's the things that young people have never had a time to explore, is that critical understanding. They know about it, they think they understand pornography, they think they understand body image, and they think they understand consent, but this opportunity to be critical about it, to learn from it, to look at other people's point of view is going to be hugely important. And the program being paired with training for teachers and parents or guardians is also hugely important, and supporting with the digital hub is also going to be a big step forward for many of the successes that will come from it. And from my point of view, cementing children's rights concept of making decisions in the best interest of children. To me, I'm delighted that all actors in a child's life will be included in this program. Active consent training to students without working with the parents or the teachers would not offer them sufficient support, and it wouldn't offer them the experience to flesh out their newfound learning. Having teachers and parents on the same page as the student around consent offers a community of people who are speaking the same language at the same time, and ensures a much more successful outcome if the child was to be taught in isolation. And again, that's the crucial part for this new way forward. And it's something that it's great to hear the NCCA thinking the same way. Of course, in a perfect world, we'd like to think attitudes towards sexual harassment and violence are changing, but the evidence shows us we have a long way to go yet in this country. Figures from the Department of Justice show the number of reported sexual offences have doubled over the past 10 years. And while it's awful to think that so many people are being hurt, it is actually positive to know that more victims have the confidence to come forward and report the crime they've suffered. It suggests people know they will receive reassurance instead of reproach, and expect to be comforted rather than made feel shame or guilt, as may have been the case in the past. Higher convictions for sexual assaults, tougher sentences, and the Me Too movement are all helping to dismantle the culture of secrecy, impunity, and victim blaming that has shrouded this area for far too long. It's my belief that the problem of sexual violence is deeply rooted in our society, and it is clear that there's still a mountain to climb. Research carried out by the Active Consent Research Team in relation to the university level students found 30% of female college students had experienced non-consensual sexual penetration due to force, the threat of force, or while they were incapacitated. And that's across 6,000 students in 21 third level campuses. That's a very robust data set. And if I'm going to put it in context, in 2018, there was over 230,000 students enrolled in higher education. And if we assume 50% of them are female, that suggests that 30% equals 35,000 students who would have experienced non-consensual sexual penetration due to force, the threat of force, or while incapacitated. And Matthew talked about the importance of bringing the consent program to the second level so that university becomes a safer place for all children and young people. And again, it was Annette mentioned the research from Dr. Michelle Walsh of NUIG in relation to Crisis Network that was published last week or last month about sexual harassment within secondary schools. She outlined a continuum of harassments from mild and moderate, which was sexual comments, jokes, sexting, seeing sexual images or being sent them, through to the most sexual harassment, which included sexual assault and extreme sexual harassment or rape. And she found, as was noted, 24% of adolescents had experienced serious sexual harassment in the past 12 months. So that's 24% of adolescents had experienced sexual assault, extreme sexual harassment, or rape in the last 12 months. And the three areas in which that happened were online, with friends, or in school. So in all the ecosystems in which they interact with each other, where their peers are, that's where the harassment was happening. And Dr. Walsh also gave a rationale for the negative sexual behaviours when she concluded that there was three major contributing factors for such harassment. One is lack of adequate RSE within the educational settings, and we've heard something about that, when Flora was talking about not getting any sexual education in the year 2021. It's hard to believe. Unsupportive social norms, and again, your research talks about some of those, and gender inequality. So having this information is vital, because once again, the import of early intervention and helping to break cycles is clear. Despite the fantastic work carried out by NUIG and active consent within the college age students, we now know that it's crucial that we begin those conversations and that learning much earlier. I wonder would this program, I would urge that this program be implemented in the widest number of schools possible. And I wonder has consideration been given to single-sex schools where the gender norms can possibly skew the students' understanding and implementation of consent. Since gender inequality and unsupportive social norms are seen as contributing to the ecosystem within which sexual harassment and assault can thrive, it would seem imperative to ensure that schools are priorities for such a program. Ireland is very much unusual around Europe in that it has so many students who go the whole way from primary school to exiting Leaving Cert in single-sex education, learning nothing or little about how to navigate relationships with their peers of another gender. We all remember the infamous criminal case in Northern Ireland, which involved a number of rugby players. And I speak now with the full understanding of the not guilty verdict, and there's no judgment around that. But what struck me was the tone of conversations reported in the text messages between the men involved and the way in which they spoke about women. We as a society have got to call out and make every effort to eradicate such blokey, sexist and misogynistic thinking among our young people, because it can be the precursor to many behaviours which are offensive and harassing. I also believe the concept of the grey areas in consent is inevitable and hugely important. And we need to offer all of our children, regardless of gender identification or sexuality, the opportunity to understand it and to discuss it and role play it in a safe and controlled environment. Consent classes at an earlier age will give students the skills they need to set boundaries, to learn what constitutes appropriate and inappropriate behaviour, and how to deal with unwanted sexual advances, online or in person. Starting in the classroom at the younger age means people do not feel embarrassment about partaking in consent workshops, and it allows them to become allies for each other. This feeds in turn into a culture of the school and what is taught among peer groups in their most formative years. That culture is vital. What will boys say to other boys if they disrespect a girl? How will one girl react to another who claims their assault? The Northern Irish case I referred to earlier raised a lot of issues about the macho culture of omerta, the assumption of consent when someone goes home with another after a few drinks. This active consent program being launched here today goes a long way towards helping with those two issues, because it outlines what can facilitate good ongoing consent and also highlights the possible barriers. And Padraig talked about those, things that facilitate good consent are good relationships, openness in the person, having confidence in yourself and others, communicating, being self-aware and educated, so understanding the facts earlier, and the ability to talk to others, as opposed to the barriers which we can all recognize from our own childhood perhaps, or growing up, being uncomfortable, awkward, embarrassed, not knowing the facts, not knowing what happens next, being afraid of being judged or rejection, a lack of knowledge or skills, the pressure we perceive from others. These are highly well researched and recognized now, and the children and young people can recognize that they can overcome those barriers and enhance their skills on the facilitation side. When it comes to sexual harassment, we cannot shy away from it. The data and statistics are there in black and white. It will only be addressed when we name it, challenge it, and take measurable actions to eliminate it. Young people need to feel empowered, safe in the knowledge that they are well equipped to take a leading role in offering active consent and therefore tackling harassment. We need to champion openness and respect among students and ensure toxic and dangerous ideas are challenged and not perpetuated by young people. We as a mature society need to be assured that all of our young people recognize that consent should be ongoing, mutual and freely given, no matter what the circumstances they find themselves in. I'm confident that this resource will help to widen understanding about consent and what healthy relationships and proper boundaries look like. The active consent program will equip students with self-confidence, and if there is something happening that they're not comfortable with, either to themselves or to their friends. And that ability to stand up for others, to be an active bystander, is a huge step forward in changing our societal response to sexual harassment and assault. The concept of having fun and pleasure and joy within your sexual relationships has to be built on the concept of consent. Therefore, I'm delighted to launch this active consent program today, and I hope that it becomes a regular fixture in the majority of secondary schools in the very near future. Thank you, and very good luck to all who are involved in rolling it out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Niall, and also to Annette. And we only have moments to go now, so don't leave us at this stage. But you know, we're really proud, I guess, to have such contributions, such varied contributions. I think if you reflect even on, you know, from Flora and Matthew and then yourselves, and what we're bringing to it in the middle, I suppose, you know, it's very exciting place to be. I'd have to say it is the culmination today of probably over 2 years work from our point of view. So it's fantastic to have your contributions. And if you're interested, and if you have access to the internet, which you probably do if you're looking at us on Zoom, you can now download our full report there. So that's going to give you the full lowdown on the research that we've done and an overview of the program. As I said at the beginning, if anybody's interested, we have a 10 ECTS credited professional development module starting from September. So please do get in touch if you'd like to share in that experience with us. We've run that module earlier this year, and just a really enriching experience for us, I think, as teachers and educators, as we worked with people from schools and colleges and various community settings from all around the country. And I think it was a really interesting experience, and it's the kind of thing that we do need to make available now, I think. The consent workshop that Siobhan spoke about, the teacher training, the parent awareness seminars are now available. And please do get in touch if you would like to hear more about that. How I learned about consent being filmed currently, our theatrical drama available from October, and then Sex on Our Screens, the sexual media e-learning resource piloting with schools this autumn. And again, if you're interested, do please get in touch with us in order to participate in that piloting process. I think all of our events tend to end in an invitation to please work in partnership with us. Yeah. We can bring certain aspects of knowledge and skills and so forth, but we've seen from the other contributors today the full range of different perspectives that's needed in order to move on this capacity, this capability that's latent sometimes in our communities, young people, teachers and parents, and turn it into consistent and confident capacity for consent. So thank you so much for your attention today. Yeah. And we did have one question, Siobhan, but we'll get back to Alan, I think, separately rather than move back into questions. So
three now.
3 questions. Okay, let's quick look at the questions.
Okay, the first question was, when were the workshops rolled out? They were rolled out between Easter and the end of the summer term in 2021. So they're very recent data in relation to that. Yes, so.
And in terms of the ongoing refresher course, this is what we hope, that through the drama, through the sexual media resource, and, you know, interaction with other programs, that, as Annette says, this would be an ongoing feature of people's experiences in the senior cycle, and indeed go all the way back. Just the other comments or questions, it's more of a comment really for you, Niall. Wisdom and clarity from Dr. Muldoon, and would love him to address principals and deputy principals network. So that's a good one. And also Anne, who asked the question, just compliments us, I think, all on excellent contributions. So listen, thanks very much. We've wasted a sunny afternoon in one way at the very end of summer, but I hope that it has been instructive and informative to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And goodbye. Bye. Yes.